The life pod was no bigger than a coffin, and it smelled like one too. Sergeant Callum Voss had been drifting for 19 days inside that metal box with nothing but recycled air, and a blinking red light that told him over and over again that help was not coming. He had stopped feeling hungry on day 12, and that scared him more than the hunger itself, because he knew what it meant when the body stopped asking for food. It meant the body had started eating itself. His muscles were thin and wasted, and his skin had gone pale like old paper, and his hands shook every time he tried to move them. But his mind was sharp, and that was the strangest part of all, because everything else was shutting down, but his brain was running faster than it ever had, like a cornered animal looking for any way out. The patrol ship that found him was not human. It was a long black vessel covered in symbols he could not read, and when the docking clamp latched onto his pod and pulled him inside, he did not even have the strength to stand. They dragged him out and laid him on a cold floor under lights that buzzed in a frequency that made his teeth ache, and he looked up and saw faces that were not faces. The first ones were tall and thin, with segmented bodies and mandibles that clicked when they spoke, and compound eyes that reflected his broken form back at him in 100 tiny images. These were the vain, and they studied him the way a child studies a beetle it has trapped under a glass. Behind them stood others, and he could barely focus, but he saw shapes that did not make sense to a human brain. Massive reptilian creatures with armored hides and teeth like industrial machinery watched him from the corner, and these were the Draelith, and they looked at him the way a butcher looks at something not worth the effort of cutting. There were others too, but Callum could not process them because his vision was fading in and out, and the only thing he could manage to say before he collapsed was a single word: food. They did not understand him. They ran scanners over his body, and the readings confused every machine they had because his organs were failing, but his neural activity was spiking in patterns they had never seen before, and the computers kept flagging errors because nothing in their databases matched his biology. He was carbon-based, and that much they understood, but everything else about him was wrong according to their models. Too soft to be a predator, and too weak to be a threat, and too small to be worth classifying as anything important. The head researcher was a Vane named Kurath, and she had been studying alien biology for longer than most species on the station had been alive, and she looked at the data on her screen and felt something she had not felt in decades: confusion. She ordered him placed in a holding cell on the lower levels where they kept organisms that had not yet been classified, and she assigned him a designation that would later become famous across the galaxy: Tier 0 Predator Organism. It was the lowest rank in their system, and it meant he was considered barely above an animal and not worth the resources required to feed or study in any meaningful way. But Kurath was thorough, and she did not like unanswered questions, so she kept the monitoring feeds active and watched. Callum lay on the floor of his cell for 2 days before he could sit up, and when he finally did, he looked around at the bare walls and the dim light and the small drain in the corner, and he understood exactly what this was: a cave. He had gone from one coffin to another. He tried to communicate, but they did not respond, and he tried banging on the walls, but his fists were so weak that the sound barely carried, and he tried everything a human being tries when they are trapped and alone and forgotten. He talked to himself, and he counted the seconds, and he made up stories in his head, and he thought about home, and he thought about the colony ship that had broken apart around him, and the people he had watched die, and the ones he had tried to save and could not. And still nobody came. On the 4th day in the cell, Kurath reviewed his readings again and noticed something that made her mandibles stop clicking. His brain activity had not decreased. In fact, it had increased. Every other species in their records showed the same pattern when approaching death, and that pattern was a slow decline into stillness as the organism accepted its end. But this one was doing the opposite. The closer he got to death, the more alive his mind became. She pulled up the visual feed and looked at his face, and what she saw there was not despair, and it was not acceptance. It was focus. His eyes were sharper than they had been when he arrived, and he was watching the door the way something watches a door when it has not given up. Kureth had seen 10,000 species pass through this station, and she had seen every kind of death there was, but she had never seen anything look at death like this human did. Like it was a problem to be solved. She called a meeting with her senior staff and proposed something that had become routine for unclassified predator organisms. An empathy capacity test. The test was simple, and it had been used for centuries, and it worked the same way every time. You placed a living creature in the cell with the subject, and you watched what happened. If the subject killed it, then it was a base predator and could be disposed of. If the subject ignored it, then it was non-sapient and could be relocated. If the subject bonded with it, then it had enough emotional capacity to be considered for sapient classification and could be given basic rights. 3 outcomes and 3 paths, and in all of Kureth's years, she had never seen a result that did not fit into one of those 3 categories. For the test creature, she selected a lumivore. It was a small animal about the size of a fox with soft fur that glowed with a pale golden light and large dark eyes that held no fear and no malice and no judgment. Lumivores were considered sacred across multiple species because they were gentle and trusting and warm, and they had a way of making every creature near them feel calm. They were also delicious to most predator species, and that was the point of the test. You gave a starving predator the most beautiful and trusting creature in the galaxy, and you watched to see what it would do. Kureth authorized the test, and her staff prepared the creature, and the observation deck filled with researchers and guards and curious crew members who had heard rumors about the strange soft alien in the lower cells. The Dralith guards placed bets on how many seconds it would take. The Vane prepared their data models. The lights on the observation screens flickered to life. And down in the cold and the dark of his cell, Callum Voss heard a sound he had not heard in weeks. A door opening. He turned his head and saw something small and glowing slide through a hatch at the base of the wall, and he blinked because, for a moment, he thought he was hallucinating. A tiny golden creature stood there looking up at him with eyes that held nothing but trust. And above him on the observation deck, every scientist on the station leaned forward and watched, and waited to see what the starving human would do. The creature stood in the doorway of the hatch, and its golden glow filled the cell with a warmth that Callum had not felt since before the colony ship broke apart. It was small and its fur was soft, and it looked like something between a fox and a kitten, and its eyes were large and dark, and full of a trust so complete that it made his chest hurt. His stomach screamed. It screamed louder than it had in days because his body recognized what his mind was still processing, and his body said that this was food and this was survival, and this was the difference between living and dying. Callum could feel his hands shaking, and he could feel his mouth watering, and he could feel every single cell in his wasted body pulling him toward the creature like gravity. Up on the observation deck, the screens showed his vitals spiking, and the Vane researchers noted the surge of adrenaline and cortisol, and the activation of what they identified as his predatory response system, and everything was going exactly the way their models predicted. The Dralith guard captain, whose name was Vorak, crossed his massive arms and grunted with satisfaction, because he had bet 40 credits that the human would kill the lumivore within 10 seconds, and he was already counting. Kureth watched with her compound eyes unblinking and her mandibles perfectly still, and she waited for the data to confirm what every model said would happen. The human would kill it. Every starving predator killed it. That was the point. Callum reached out his hand and the Lumivore did not flinch. And it did not run because Lumivores had never learned to fear anything, and that was both their beauty and their TR. Agedy. His fingers touched its fur, and it was warm and impossibly soft, and the creature made a small sound like a purr mixed with a chime, and it stepped forward and pressed itself against his palm. He could feel its heartbeat. It was fast and light and alive, and it was the first living warmth he had touched in almost a month, and something inside him broke, but it did not break in the way the scientists expected. Callum picked up the Lumivore with both hands and brought it close to his face, and it looked at him with those huge dark eyes, and he could see himself reflected in them, and what he saw was a skeleton of a man with hollow cheeks and cracked lips and sunken eyes. And the creature looked at that horror and was not afraid. It nuzzled into his neck and made that chiming sound again, and Callum felt tears on his face before he even knew he was crying. He did not eat it. Up on the observation deck nobody moved. Callum held the Lumivore against his chest with one arm, and with his other hand he began to unzip the top of his tattered flight suit, and the Dralith guard captain leaned forward, because he thought the human was preparing to bite. But Callum pulled the creature inside his suit and pressed it against his bare skin where it was warmest, and he zipped the suit back up with the Lumivore nestled against his heart. Then he tore a strip of fabric from his sleeve, and his hands were shaking so badly that it took him 4 tries, and he folded the strip into a small pad and placed it in the corner of the cell, and then he gently took the Lumivore out of his suit and set it down on the makeshift nest and arranged the fabric around it. And then he sat back against the wall, and he did not eat, and he did not sleep, and he did not close his eyes. He watched over it. On the observation deck, the silence was so heavy that it felt like pressure. Vorak uncrossed his arms and his bet was forgotten, and he stared at the screen with an expression that nobody had ever seen on a Dralith face before. Kureth checked her models 3 times because the data was not matching any of the 3 predicted outcomes. The human had not killed it, and that eliminated outcome 1. He had not ignored it, and that eliminated outcome 2. He had bonded with it, but he had done so in a way that went far beyond what outcome 3 described, because outcome 3 was simple recognition of another living being, and what this human was doing was something else entirely. He was protecting it at the cost of his own survival. He was spending calories he did not have to keep it warm and to build it a nest and to stay awake and guard it, and every single one of those actions was pushing him closer to death. Their models had no category for this. A researcher named Turavel, who was younger than the others and had always asked too many questions according to Kureth, spoke up and said that maybe the models were wrong. Kureth told her to be silent and to log the data. Hours passed and the Lumivore slept, and Callum did not. He talked to it in a low and gentle voice, and the words meant nothing because they were in a language no one on the station understood, but the tone was unmistakable. He was telling it that everything was going to be okay. He was lying, of course, because nothing was okay, and he was dying, and he knew it, but he said it anyway because that is what humans do when something small and scared is depending on them. They lie with kindness, and they make it true by refusing to let it be false. The night cycle came and the lights in the cell dimmed, and the Lumivore woke up and climbed into his lap, and Callum held it and started to sing. It was not a good song, and his voice was cracked and barely louder than a whisper, and he could not remember all the words, so he hummed the parts he had forgotten. It was a lullaby that his mother had sung to him when he was small and afraid of the dark, and he had not thought about it in 20 years, but it came back to him now in this cell on the far side of the galaxy, because some things live deeper than memory. The Lumivore listened, and its glow began to change. It had been a soft pale gold when they put it in the cell, and that was normal and healthy and expected. But now as Callum sang, it began to glow brighter and warmer, and the color deepened into something rich and radiant like sunlight through honey. On the observation deck, the instruments registered the change and alarms started going off, because the Lumivore's bioluminescent output had exceeded its recorded maximum by 300% and was still climbing. Turavel pulled up the historical data on Lumivore behavior and searched for any instance of a glow at this intensity, and she found nothing. Not in captivity, and not in the wild, and not in any study ever conducted across the entire conclave. The glow meant safety. That was well established in the research, and every scientist knew that Lumivores glowed brighter when they felt safe and secure. And this Lumivore was glowing brighter than any Lumivore had ever glowed in the recorded history of the species. Brighter than it had glowed for the Auravani, who considered themselves the most enlightened beings in the galaxy. Brighter than it had glowed for the Vane who had studied and cared for Lumivores for centuries. Brighter than it had glowed for anyone. It was glowing like that for a dying man in a cage who had nothing to offer it except warmth and a broken lullaby. Kureth stood very still at her console, and for the second time in a week she felt something she was not accustomed to feeling. Not confusion this time. Something worse. Doubt. She turned to her staff and gave an order that would later be questioned in every ethics review the conclave had. Continue the test and do not feed him. She wanted to see how far this went. She wanted to see when the human would finally break and choose himself over the creature. Because surely he would. Everything broke eventually. Down in the cell, Callum finished his song, and the Lumivore chirped once and closed its eyes, and its glow held steady and warm and golden. Callum leaned his head back against the wall and looked up at the ceiling, and he knew they were watching, and he knew what they were waiting for. And he made a decision that was not rational, and was not strategic, and made no sense from any biological or evolutionary standpoint. He decided that this creature was his to protect, and that he would protect it until he could not protect anything anymore. He closed his eyes, and he did not sleep, but he rested, and the Lumivore glowed on his chest like a small sun. And on the observation deck, 37 scientists from 4 different species watched in silence, and not one of them could explain what they were seeing. 3 more days passed, and Callum Voss should have been dead. The Vane medical models said he should have died on day 2 of the test, and the Dralith physiological charts said he should have died on day 1, and the Auravani probability calculations gave him a 0.4% chance of surviving past the first night with the Lumivore in his cell. But Callum was not dead. He was thinner than a human being should be able to be and still breathe, and his skin was stretched over his bones like cloth over a frame, and his hands trembled constantly, and his vision blurred every time he moved his head too fast. But he was alive, and every single morning when the lights in his cell flickered on, he checked the Lumivore first before he checked himself. He had named it. He called it Saul because its glow reminded him of the sun he had grown up under, and he talked to it constantly in a voice that was getting weaker by the hour. He shared his water ration with it, even though the scientists had provided a separate water dispenser for the creature, and even though sharing meant he was getting less than his body needed. He had made it a toy. A sensor node had come loose from the ceiling of his cell on the second day, and Callum had caught it before it could fall on Saul, and then he had spent an hour bending and shaping the small metal piece into something that rolled and spun when you pushed it, and Saul loved it. Saul would bat the toy across the floor and chase it and bring it back to Callum, and drop it in his lap and wait with those enormous dark eyes until he pushed it again. And every time Callum pushed it, he used energy he did not have, and every time he smiled at the creature, his body burned fuel it could not replace. The observation deck had become the most visited place on the station. Crew members from every species found excuses to walk past and glance at the screens, and what had started as a minor biology experiment had become the only thing anyone talked about. The Dralith guards who rotated through the observation shifts stopped placing bets on the second day, and by the fourth day they were watching in silence with their arms at their sides. Vorek, the guard captain, had not spoken about the Huma in 2 days, and when a younger Dralith made a joke about the soft little alien starving to death in the basement, Vorek turned and looked at him with an expression that made the younger soldier take 3 steps back. The Oravani were the oldest and wisest species in the conclave, and they existed as beings of living gas contained in crystalline shells, and they did not experience emotion the way solid beings did, but they had gathered near the observation deck in numbers that had not been seen since the last conclave summit. They were not watching the human. They were watching the Lumivore, because the Lumivore had stopped behaving like a Lumivore. On the 5th day, the researchers attempted to retrieve Saul remotely by activating the hatch at the base of the wall and sending a gentle electromagnetic pulse designed to guide Lumivores back to their habitats. Saul ignored it. They tried again with a stronger pulse, and Saul pressed itself closer to Callum and made a sound that no one had ever heard a Lumivore make before. It growled, a tiny, barely audible vibration in its throat, but it was unmistakable, and the researchers stared at each other because Lumivores did not growl, and Lumivores did not resist retrieval, and Lumivores absolutely did not choose a specific being over the safety of their habitat. But Saul had chosen. It had chosen the dying man who sang to it and shared water with it and made it toys from broken ceiling parts, and it was not going to leave. That was when Kureth called the emergency meeting, and that was when things began to crack. The meeting was held in the station's central chamber, and representatives from all 4 resident species attended, and the argument started immediately. The Dralith commander wanted the test terminated, and the human disposed of because he said that an organism that defied classification was by definition a threat, and threats were to be eliminated. The Oravani elder, whose name translated roughly to stillness before dawn, argued that they were witnessing something unprecedented, and that destroying it would be a crime against knowledge itself. The Vane Council was split down the middle, with half agreeing with Kureth that the test should continue, and the other half demanding intervention. And in the middle of all of this shouting and clicking and rumbling, Turavel stood up. She was young for a Vane researcher, and she had been told to be silent more times than she could count, but she had spent the last 3 days doing something that no one else had thought to do. She had gone back to the human's life pod, and she had pulled every fragment of data from its damaged computer, and she had spent 70 hours without sleep translating and cross-referencing, and building a profile of the species that Callum Voss belonged to. And what she had found made her afraid in a way she had never been afraid before. She stood before the assembled representatives, and she spoke. Humans, she said, are not Tier 0. The chamber went quiet. Humans, she continued, are persistence predators, and this means they evolved not to be the fastest or the strongest, but to be the thing that never stops. She pulled up the data and showed them that humans could run for entire days without rest, and that their bodies could heal from injuries that would kill any species in the conclave, and that they had pain responses that could be overridden by conscious will. She showed them that humans had domesticated wolves and turned them into companions, and that they had tamed horses and ridden them across continents, and that they had looked at the most dangerous creatures on their world, and instead of avoiding them, had decided to make friends with them. She showed them that humans had built ships from wood and crossed oceans that had no end in sight, and that they had invented weapons capable of cracking their own world in half, and had then chosen not to use them. And she showed them the brain scans from Callum's cell. His neural architecture had changed in the 5 days since Saul had been placed with him, and the pain processing centers in his brain had been suppressed and rerouted, and the regions associated with bonding and protection had expanded to a degree that the Vane neurologist said should not be possible in a living organism. His brain was rewriting itself in real time. It was shutting down the parts that said he was dying and amplifying the parts that said the creature in his arms needed him. He was not surviving despite his bond with Saul. He was surviving because of it. Kureth listened to all of this, and her compound eyes were very still, and when Turevel finished speaking, the head researcher said one sentence. No Tier 0 species has ever been reclassified. And that was the end of the meeting. Turevel returned to her lab, and she sat in the dark for a long time, and then she did something that violated every protocol she had ever been taught. She went to the food synthesis bay, and she tried to make something the human could eat. She did not have the right base compounds because nothing on the station was designed for carbon-based biology, but she tried anyway, and what she produced was a gray slab of nutrients designed for silicon-based metabolisms, and she knew it would not work, but she had to try. She brought it to the cell herself, and she opened the door and stepped inside, and Callum looked up at her from the floor where he lay with Saul curled on his chest. She held out the food, and he took it with hands that shook like leaves in a storm, and he bit into it and chewed and swallowed, and within minutes his body rejected it, and he turned to the side and vomited. But before he turned back, he did something that Turevel did not expect. He looked at her and he nodded, and he pressed his hand to his chest, and the gesture was unmistakable even across species. "Thank you." She left the cell and the door sealed behind her, and she stood in the corridor, and she felt something happening inside her thorax that the vein did not have a word for. Back in the cell, Callum wiped his mouth and pulled Saul closer, and the little creature chirped with concern, and he whispered that he was fine and that everything was okay, and the lie was so practiced now that it almost sounded true. And then Callum collapsed. His body finally gave out and he fell sideways, and Saul tumbled from his chest and landed on the floor and immediately scrambled back to him and climbed onto his chest, and that was when it happened. Saul began to glow in a way that was not light. It was deeper than light, and it had a sound, and the sound was a frequency that hummed through the walls and the floor and the air itself, and the instruments on the observation deck did not just spike, they broke. 3 monitors shattered and 2 scanners overloaded, and the rest displayed readings that the vein had only ever seen in theoretical papers that they had dismissed as impossible. Saul was emitting a healing harmonic. It was a frequency that lumivore biologists had theorized existed deep in the species' genetic code, but that had never been activated and never been observed, and was considered by most serious scientists to be a myth. The theory said that lumivores carried within them the ability to heal other living beings through resonant bioluminescent energy transfer, but that this ability would only activate under one condition. The lumivore had to love the being it was trying to save. Saul glowed brighter and brighter, and the golden light filled the cell and spilled under the door and into the corridor, and Turevel, who was still standing outside, felt the warmth on her carapace and turned around. She ran, not away from the cell but toward it. She entered an override code and the door opened, and she stepped inside, and the light was so bright that she had to shield her eyes, and through the glare she could see the small golden creature pouring everything it had into the man who had given it everything he had. And Turevel made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. She was going to save him. Turevel knelt beside the human, and the golden light from Saul was so intense that it burned patterns into her vision like staring at a star. She could feel the harmonic frequency vibrating through the floor and up through her legs and into her thorax, and it was not unpleasant, but it was powerful and deep, and it made something inside her resonate in a way she did not understand. Callum was unconscious, and his breathing was so shallow that she had to press her sensory appendage against his mouth to confirm that air was still moving, and it was but barely. Saul was draped across his chest, and the little creature was trembling with effort, and its golden light pulsed in rhythm with the human's heartbeat, as if it was trying to keep that heart going by sheer will alone. Turavel had spent the last 6 hours studying human biology from the fragments in the pod computer, and she knew that what he needed was simple. Carbon-based. Nutrients and water and glucose and proteins and fats. She could not synthesize human food, but she could approximate something close enough to keep him alive if she was clever and if she was fast. She ran back to her lab and she worked with a focus that surprised even herself, and she pulled compounds from 3 different nutrient systems, and she mixed and tested and failed and mixed again. And on the 7th attempt, she produced a thick pale paste that her analysis said contained enough compatible carbon chains to be absorbed by a human digestive system, without rejection. She brought it back to the cell and she sat on the floor beside him, and she scooped the paste onto her finger, and she pressed it to his lips. He did not respond. She pressed harder and let the paste slide between his cracked lips, and she waited. And after a moment that felt like an entire age of the galaxy, his throat moved. He swallowed. She gave him more and he swallowed again, and the color did not return to his face, but the terrible grayness receded just slightly, and after 20 minutes of this slow, careful feeding his eyes opened. He looked at her, and she could see that he did not know where he was or what she was, and his eyes were glassy and unfocused. But then Saul chirped from his chest, and Callum's eyes changed. The fog cleared and the focus returned, and the first thing he said in a voice like sand scraping over stone was a single word. Saul. He reached up with a trembling hand and touched the lumivore, and Saul pressed into his palm, and the golden glow steadied and warmed, and Callum let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for days. Then he looked at Turavel, and he saw the paste on her fingers, and he understood what she had done. He tried to speak again, and it took him 3 attempts, but he managed to form the words. Is she okay? Not am I okay, and not what happened, and not where am I. Is she okay? He was asking about Saul. Turavel did not speak his language and her translator was still being calibrated, but she understood the gesture when Callum pointed at Saul, and then looked at her with those strange round human eyes that held so much expression that it was almost overwhelming for a vein to process. She pointed at Saul and made an upward motion, and what she meant was that the creature was fine and strong and healthy. Callum closed his eyes, and something in his face, relaxed like a rope that had been pulled tight for weeks, finally going slack. Over the next 2 days, Turavel returned to his cell every 6 hours and fed him the paste, and each time she came Callum was a little stronger, and each time Saul glowed a little brighter, and each time the observation deck had more silent watchers. The word had spread beyond the research staff. Dralith soldiers came during their off shifts and stood at the back of the observation room and watched without speaking, and there was something in the way they stood that was different from how Dralith usually stood, because they were not standing at attention, and they were not standing at rest. They were standing witness. An old Dralith veteran named Koth, who had 3 ceremonial scars across his jaw from 3 different wars, came to the observation deck on the 2nd day, and he watched for 4 hours without moving. When a younger researcher asked him why he was there, he said that in 3 wars he had never seen anything show that much will to protect another being, and that he wanted to remember what it looked like. The Oravani had stopped gathering near the observation deck because they had moved directly outside the cell, and their crystalline shells hummed with a frequency that the vain scientists later identified as their equivalent of reverence. And through all of this Kureth watched and said nothing. On the 3rd day after Turavel's intervention, Callum was strong enough to sit up on his own, and Saul had taken to sitting on his shoulder, and the creature had not left physical contact with him for more than a few minutes at a time since the healing harmonic event. Turavel brought him a translator that she had calibrated using the audio files from his pod, and when she placed it near his ear and spoke the first words he heard in an alien language that he could understand were, "You should be dead." He looked at her, and after a moment he laughed, and the sound was rough and broken, but it was a laugh, and it was the first human laughter ever heard on the station, and every alien who heard it stopped what they were doing, because it was a sound unlike anything in their experience. It was warm and it was strange, and it was completely unguarded. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked through the translator. She told him, and he tried to pronounce it, and got it wrong, and tried again and got it wrong again. And on the fifth attempt, he got close enough that she understood, and he smiled, and said it was a beautiful name. She did not know how to respond to that because Vane did not compliment each other's designations, but she found that the statement was not unpleasant. Then Callum asked the question she had been dreading. Why did they put Saul in my cell? And Turavel, who was not supposed to tell him, the truth told him anyway, because she had already broken every other rule and one more did not matter. She told him about the empathy test and the 3 expected outcomes, and how he had broken all of their models, and how Kureth had ordered them not to feed him, because she wanted to see when he would break. Callum listened, and his face did not change, and when she was finished, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said something that Turavel would later include in her formal report to the conclave. He said that he was not angry. He said that he understood that they were afraid of what they did not know, and that fear makes people do cruel things regardless of what species they are. And then he said that he forgave them. Turavel stared at him, and she did not understand how a being that had been starved and caged and tested like an animal could say those words and mean them. But he meant them. She could see it in his face, and she could see it in the way Saul glowed when he said it, because the Lumivore's light responded to emotional truth, and it was burning like a bonfire. On the 4th day, Kureth convened an emergency tribunal, and the question she put before the assembled species was not what to do with the human. The question was, what is a human? Turavel stood before the tribunal and presented her findings, and she did not hold anything back. She told them about persistence predators, and the ability to run for days, and the capacity to override pain through conscious choice, and the healing of wounds that would kill other species. She told them about wolves becoming dogs, and wild cats becoming companions, and horses becoming partners, and how humans looked at the most dangerous things on their world and decided to love them. She told them about wooden ships on endless oceans, and splitting atoms and choosing not to end themselves. And then she told them what she believed was the truth about humanity. She said that humans did not evolve claws or armor or venom, because they did not need to. She said that they had evolved something more powerful than any weapon. They had evolved the ability to form bonds with anything alive. Not just their own kind, and not just similar species, but anything. Anything that breathed, and anything that moved, and anything that looked at them with need in its eyes. She said this was not weakness, and it was not sentimentality. She said it was the most dangerous adaptation in the galaxy, because it meant that a human would fight for you and die for you, and sacrifice everything for you, even if you were a different species, and even if you had given them nothing, and even if there was no biological or evolutionary reason for them to care. And you could never predict what they would sacrifice for, and you could never break the bond without destroying the human entirely. The tribunal chamber was very quiet when she finished. The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. Callum Voss was reclassified, not to Tier 1 or Tier 2, or any existing rank in the system. A new designation was created, and it was the first new tier added to the Conclave classification system in over 800 years. Tier Absolute, and the subtitle was Bonding Apex. When the vote was announced, Callum was brought to the tribunal chamber, and he walked in on his own legs, still thin and unsteady, and Saul sat on his shoulder glowing like a golden lamp. Kureth looked at him from behind her console, and she asked through the translator the question that every species in the room wanted answered. Why did you not eat it? And Callum looked at Saul, and the little creature looked back at him and chirped once, and he scratched behind its ear the way he had learned it liked. And then he looked at the assembled aliens who had starved him and caged him and tested him and watched him almost die. And he said, "Because she was scared, and I know what that feels like." The chamber was silent for a very long time, and in that silence, something changed that could not be unchanged. The conclave had seen what a human was, and they were not ready for what came next. 6 months later, the station was unrecognizable, and the change had started so quietly that nobody noticed until it was everywhere. It began with the mess hall. The conclave station had 4 separate eating areas because the Vane ate in silence, and the Dralith ate in groups arranged by rank, and the Oravani did not eat at all, but absorbed ambient energy and preferred solitude while doing so. Callum ate in whichever hall had an open seat, and Saul sat on the table beside him, and within 2 weeks all 4 eating areas had merged into one, because everyone wanted to eat where the human was. It was not that he did anything extraordinary during meals. He just talked. He asked the Dralith about their homeworld, and he listened when they told him about the red canyons and the twin moons, and the songs their mothers sang to them before their first battle trial, and no one had ever asked them about their mothers before because the Dralith were warriors and warriors were not supposed to have mothers who sang. He asked the Vane about their research, and he did not just politely nod the way diplomats did, but he asked follow-up questions that showed he was actually thinking about what they said, and this confused them because no species had ever been genuinely curious about Vane entomological studies. He sat near the Oravani and said nothing because he had figured out within the first week that the Oravani valued silence and presence over conversation, and so he would just sit beside them and read data pads that Turavel had loaded with translated conclave history, and the Oravani began seeking him out specifically, because they said that his silence was the most comfortable silence they had ever shared with a solid being. Within a month, the mess hall had become the social center of the station, and species that had maintained cold professional distances for decades were sitting at the same tables, and it was not because anyone had told them to. It was because Callum made it feel normal. He had a way of treating every species as if they were just people, and the effect of this was devastating in ways that none of them could have predicted. The Dralith and the Vane had been in a low-level territorial dispute over mining rights in the Cathara system for 70 years, and it had resisted every diplomatic effort from every mediator the conclave had appointed. Callum resolved it over dinner. He did not use negotiation tactics or political leverage or threats. He asked both sides to explain what they actually needed and not what they were demanding, and then he asked if anyone had ever thought about just sharing the system and splitting the output based on who could use which resources. The Dralith needed the heavy metals, and the Vane needed the rare gases, and there was no actual overlap. They had been fighting for 70 years over a problem that did not exist, and all it took was someone from outside both species to sit them down and ask the obvious question that pride had prevented either side from asking. The agreement was signed the next day, and it became known informally as the dinner accord. Saul had changed too. The Lumivore was now the most studied creature in conclave history, and every week brought new discoveries about what the bond with Callum had unlocked. The healing harmonics that Saul had used to save Callum's life were not a one-time event, and they had grown stronger and more refined, and Saul could now emit targeted frequencies that accelerated cellular repair in carbon-based organisms, and the Vane Medical Division had begun studying whether these frequencies could be adapted for other biologies. More remarkable was the emotional resonance that Saul projected when near Callum. Other beings in their vicinity reported feeling calmer and more open and more willing to listen, and the Oravani elder Stillness Before Dawn said that being near the bonded pair was like standing in a warm current in a cold ocean. But the most extraordinary discovery came from the telepathic impressions. Saul had begun projecting rudimentary images and emotions to beings near Callum, and these were not random, but seemed to be intentional communications. The first time it happened was during a tense meeting between a Dralith commander and a Vane trade delegate, and Saul had projected an image of both of them as small young versions of their species sitting side by side and looking up at stars. The meeting had ended, with both parties agreeing to terms that neither had expected to accept. Vane xenobiologists theorized that lumivores had always carried these abilities encoded in their genetics like seeds waiting for rain, but that no species had ever triggered them because no species had ever bonded with a lumivore the way a human could. The bonding was not just emotional attachment. It was something deeper and more complete, and the Vane word for it translated roughly as soul grafting, and it meant that Callum and Saul had become something together that neither could have been alone. But of all the changes that rippled out from Callum Voss and his golden companion, the biggest was the one that shook the conclave to its foundations. The classification system was crumbling. If the tier system had been wrong about humans, then what else was it wrong about? The Oravani had been pushing for reform for centuries, but had never had enough support, and now suddenly they did, because the proof was walking around the station with a glowing creature on his shoulder resolving ancient disputes and making warriors cry. Turevel had become Callum's closest ally, and together they had spent 3 months drafting a document that would replace the old tier system entirely. They called it the Voss Accord. The core principle was simple and radical. Species would no longer be classified by physical capability or technological advancement or threat level. They would be classified by their capacity for connection, the ability to bond and to empathize and to reach across the void between different forms of life and find common ground. It was the most controversial document in the history of the conclave, and the debates lasted for weeks, and there were threats of withdrawal from 3 species and 1 near-violent confrontation in the council chamber. But in the end it passed by a single vote. The deciding vote was cast by Vorek, the Dralith Guard captain, who had once bet 40 credits that Callum would eat the lumivore in 10 seconds. When asked why he voted yes, Vorek said that he had watched a dying man choose to protect something small and helpless, when every rational calculation said he should save himself, and that if the universe contained beings capable of that, then the universe deserved a better system for understanding them. Earth had been contacted. The message had been sent 3 months ago using coordinates from Callum's pod, and a conclave delegation was being assembled to make first contact with humanity as a whole. Callum stood at the observation deck of the station, looking out at the stars, and Saul was on his shoulder glowing with that steady, warm, golden light that had become the most famous glow in the galaxy. He was thinking about home and about the billions of people who had no idea that the universe was full of life, and that a single act of kindness in a dark cell had rewritten the rules of an interstellar civilization. Turevel found him there, and she stood beside him, and they were quiet together for a while, because they had learned each other's silences and knew when words were needed and when they were not. Eventually she spoke. "Are you afraid of what they will think of your people?" Callum thought about this, and a smile crossed his face, and it was the same kind of smile that had confused every species on the station, because it contained warmth and mischief and sadness and hope all at once. "No," he said, and then he paused, and the smile grew wider. "I am afraid of what my people will try to adopt first." Turevel tilted her head in the vain gesture of confusion. "Last time we met something new and interesting," Callum said. "We ended up with dogs and cats and horses and ferrets and parrots, and every bird that would hold still long enough and quite a few that would not." He looked out at the stars, and the smile faded into something softer and more serious. "The galaxy is not ready," he said, "for 8 billion people who look at an alien and think friend." Terevel considered this, and she thought about the dinner accord and the healing harmonics, and the warriors who had stood witness, and the elder who felt warmth in the current, and the guard captain who changed his vote, and the small golden creature that had loved a dying stranger. And she thought what it would mean when it was not just one human, but billions of them spreading across the stars, with that impossible, unstoppable need to reach out and connect, and bond and protect, and love every living thing they encountered, whether it wanted to be loved or not. "No," she said quietly, and her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen the future, and found it terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. "I do not think it is." Saul chirped once from Callum's shoulder, and the sound was bright and clear, and it echoed off the observation deck windows and out into the dark where the stars burned in their billions. And Saul glowed brighter. Not because anything had changed in that moment, but because everything had changed 6 months ago in a cold, dark cell, when a starving man held a frightened creature and chose to be kind. And the light from that choice was still spreading, and it would keep spreading, because that is what light does when you refuse to let it go out. Somewhere out there Earth was waiting, and it did not know it yet, but the galaxy was about to get a lot louder, and a lot warmer, and a lot stranger. And it was never going to be the same again. Saul glowed and Callum smiled, and the stars burned on, and somewhere in the vast, indifferent dark something that had always been cold began very slowly, and for the very first time, to feel something like warmth.